Greetings, everyone. Welcome. I'm Howie Bierbaum, the Executive Director of the Eastside Jewish Commons. Thanks for coming tonight. Tonight is Antisemitism on the Left. The evening will proceed as follows. We have our esteemed experts here. It's going to be a three-pronged approach. We're going to talk about the history of anti-Semitism, the modern challenges it poses, ways of tackling anti-Semitism in the Northwest, and the rabbi will talk about what it means to, Rabbi Stone will talk about being Jewish in America today, and in Portland especially. More volume, please. And Rabbi Jacobs is from Boston, and she'll be speaking to the modern challenges of Jews navigating social justice work in progressive circles. So thanks for coming. I'm going to turn it over first to Shane. Why don't you introduce yourself?
Hey, raise your hand if you can hear me okay. Okay. Hey, my name is Shane Burley. I'm a writer and researcher, researching most of the far right and social movements and anti-Semitism. I have a book coming out next year called Safety and Solidarity, Anti-Fascist Approaches to Anti-Semitism. And I write for a number of places on this subject, Haaretz, Tikkun, NBC News, Daily Beast, stuff like that.
Okay, can you hear me? Great. Hi, I'm Natan Meir. I am the Laurie Lokay Professor of Judaic Studies in the Harold Schnitzer Family Program in Judaic Studies at Portland State University. I am required to say all those things. And I am a scholar of modern Jewish history, specifically the social and cultural history of the Jews of Eastern Europe.
My name is Rabbi Ariel Stone. I am a congregational rabbi and also a street activist rabbi. I've been in Portland since 1996, except for 2 years, which I spent on a fellowship in Israel. And my focus is on creating spiritual community with the Jews of Portland who step through the doors of my shul or who I meet downtown, and parsing with them what it means to be a Jew in Portland in the 21st century.
Hi, I'm Rabbi Jill Jacobs. I'm the CEO of TRUA, the Rabbinic Call for Human Rights, which organizes and trains more than 2,300 rabbis and cantors across the US and Canada, including, of course, Rabbi Stone as a member, to work on human rights issues. Half of our work is here in North America and half of our work is in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories. And as I'll talk about a little bit later, that includes us doing a lot of work about anti-Semitism. And I live in New York, not in Boston.
Okay. Natan, you're up.
Okay, all right, thanks, Howie. I'm just going to note what time it is because I want to make sure that I just stick to my time. So I'm going to, okay. So I've been asked to give a historical background for anti-Semitism on the left, which I will try to do. So I think our usual historical perception of anti-Semitism is that it is a right-wing phenomenon. And although, of course, we can trace anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism back into the Middle Ages, anti-Semitism, as we know it today, emerges as a modern phenomenon in the 19th century. And so often we connect it with the right-wing, xenophobic, and often racist nationalism that emerged in 19th century Europe. But there is also anti-Semitism on the left. And its roots are usually traced to the Enlightenment of the 18th century, which was based on on rational thought, the quest for universal ideals for humanity. And Enlightenment thinkers, usually the one who's pointed to is Voltaire, but there are others as well. He's the one who speaks most venomously of Jews. Some Enlightenment thinkers perceive the Jews as living a very parochial, kind of cramped existence centered on an irrational, superstitious religion and on a tribal identity. And for them, this was a relic of a primitive past that needed to be left behind as humanity advanced. And so they pointed to the Jews as the example par excellence of what humanity needs not to be anymore. Now, this is somewhat paradoxical because it was, of course, Enlightenment thought that paved the way for the emancipation of the Jews in Europe, meaning the granting to Jews in the course of the 19th and early 20th century of political and civic rights. So you could call it a double-edged sword. But actually, the roots of left anti-Semitism go back further than that. And I mentioned the Middle Ages, and that's where I want to go to right now, because that's when Jews in Christian Europe became associated with money. And that's really key for our understanding of anti-Semitism on the left. And there are certain figures in medieval European history who become somewhat emblematic for the association of Jews with money. For example, the wealthy Jewish financiers in European courts who served as bankers and you might say treasurers to European kingdoms. And most obviously the figure of the Jewish moneylender, as Jews were squeezed out of other occupations in the High Middle Ages, and many of them came to end up in this very, very reviled occupation. And those images persist into the modern era, which is, and so when I say modern, I'm talking about essentially the 19th century, into the early 20th century. And this is a period in Europe when some Jews are well positioned to take advantage of the opportunities that the emerging capitalist economy offers. And then Jews become disproportionately represented in banking, in finance, in industry. And as I was just stressing today to my class, my survey of Jewish history class that I was teaching earlier today, I said to them, nothing is inevitable in Jewish history because of anything inherent in Jews or Judaism. This is all basically governed by socioeconomic structures. Because there's a certain person in my class who's made some remarks about, well, and this is a senior auditor, an older person who is originally from the Czech Republic, who said, well, when I was growing up, all the Jews were all doctors and bankers and journalists, and they all were successful. I said, and yes, there was a reason for that. There's a specific kind of structures that lead to that. There's nothing inherent in the Jews that make them smart, right? As people sometimes will say, the Jews are so smart. So the medieval moneylender in this way morphs into the international banker or the global capitalist. And there's another reason in the modern period that people feel that they can be hostile to Jews, because in a certain critique of modern capitalism, the capitalist doesn't actually do any work. The banker doesn't actually do any work. They are parasites who feed off of the real labor of other people, of honest, hardworking people. Usually what this means is that the Jew is the sponge who lives off of the work of the Christians. That's how it plays out in anti-Semitic rhetoric. Now, it's interesting that some Europeans in the 19th century saw the modern transformations that were taking place in Europe at the time, which have to do with with modern capitalism very often. So industrialization, urbanization, all of these wholesale transformations that are changing society in so many ways. And some people see these transformations as related to Jews, or to put it more bluntly, the Judaization of society. And the best known example of this is Marx, who wrote an article in the 1840s, an essay called On the Jewish Question, where while he acknowledged that Jews as individuals deserved equal rights, he said society or humanity needed to be emancipated from Judaism, because he equated Judaism with capitalism. And so I have a quote here from that essay. What is the secular basis of Judaism? Right? So he's not talking about Judaism as a religion. He's talking about it as a kind of a way of perceiving the world or approaching the world. Practical need and self-interest. What is the worldly religion of the Jew? Huckstering. What is his worldly god? Money. Money is the jealous god of Israel, in face of which no other god may exist. In the final analysis, the emancipation of the Jews is the emancipation of mankind from Judaism. So this doesn't mean, of course, that Marxism saw all Jews as evil, or that all Marxists are anti-Semites. I mean, if Jews were oppressed by capitalism, then they too deserve to be emancipated. But many Marxists did feel that Jews contributed disproportionately to the evils of capitalism, and that Jews, by dint of history, had certain habits that they carried with them that they needed to be willing to relinquish in order to move forward towards progress. And I think as a result of that, left-wing movements, both in Europe and the United States, have inherited, let's say, a certain current of anti-Semitism in their critique of urban finance capitalists, urban finance capital. And I think you can find traces of that rhetoric today in the term globalist, although it's also used on the right. So it's a difficult term to decode. But I think it is also sometimes used on the left, because if you're talking about international elites, which are conspiring to dismantle Western society using their control over big corporations, then that could be a critique from the left. And that often refers to Jews in a coded way. The last piece that I want to talk about is much more recent, so post-World War II, and that is anti-Semitism, and here we have also anti-Zionism as anti-imperialism. So this is a transformation of leftist narratives that we find in the 19th and early 20th centuries into something that has inherited certain elements of the previous iterations, but also has something new. And this emerges in the Soviet Union after World War II. When the Soviet Union, although at first is allied with the very new state of Israel and votes for the creation of the state of Israel in the United Nations, ultimately becomes anti-Zionist and exports a very virulent anti-Zionism, which is suffused with anti-Semitism, to the rest of the communist world and also to the Arab world. And this is a kind of anti-Zionism. And here, I mean, sometimes we can somehow distinguish between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, but not here. This is an anti-Zionism where if you see the caricatures in the Soviet press, it's the hook-nosed Jew. So it's very clearly that. And it's a form of anti-imperialism. So it sees Zionism as a militaristic, imperialistic power in alliance with the United States. And this vision, this perception sees the Arab world at that time in the 60s, 50s, 60s, 70s as part of an emancipatory power, an emancipatory movement that's seeking to liberate oppressed peoples, and therefore it is something that the left can embrace. We could also, in this same moment, talk about Black power in the United States, emerging in the 1960s, which tends to sympathize with oppressed peoples throughout the world, and therefore with the Palestinians against the Israelis. And there's kind of this, dichotomous view of the world. That's not always anti-Semitic, but it can be anti-Semitic, right? That's an important distinction. And this kind of anti-Semitism often perceives Israel as and again, here the distinction between right-wing and left-wing anti-Semitism is sometimes difficult to parse, but it perceives Israel as a uniquely evil entity that poses a danger to the entire world. So in terms of left-wing anti-Semitism, Zionism, as I said, is integrally linked to the US and to American imperialism, which is closely connected to global capitalism. So there we have the link to capitalism. And on the right wing, there's this sense of a conspiracy theory, which you always find in right-wing anti-Semitism, that Zionism is this danger to the whole world, and that links up to this idea of the United States as conspiring, planning to take over the entire world and enmesh it in its own clutches. The last thing I'll say very quickly is that that idea of Israel as militaristic and expansionist, and that's not disconnected from the reality, right? We can argue about to what extent Israel is that, but if you take it to an extreme, you often find in anti-Zionist rhetoric the idea of Israel as a warmongering power, as a country that seeks to foment discord and to stir up war, and that is also an anti-Semitic trope in history. And we can talk maybe in the question and answer about exactly where that stems from, but certainly in the 20th century, there's plenty of historical evidence, not least the Nazis, accusing the Jews of using their global capitalist connections to stir up war between other peoples for their own benefit. And if you think of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, that kind of classic anti-Semitic text, that is a place where you can find that kind of accusation against Jews as well, that Jews are kind of working from undercover, secretly trying to stir up all kinds of conflict between peoples. So I'm going to stop there, and then we'll have a discussion afterwards, and I'll be happy to contribute to that too.
Okay, next up, please welcome Rabbi Jill Jacobs.
Thank you so much. Sorry, I can't be with you in person. It looks fantastic there, but I'm on the other side of the country. So thank you so much to Natan for the historical context. I want to talk a little bit about what I've seen working in the progressive world, also working to fight anti-Semitism on the right, really anti-Semitism everywhere. I'm going to unpack the question of anti-Semitism on the right, anti-Semitism on the left as I talk a little bit. So I'm speaking from the perspective not of a historian, because I'm not a historian, but a practitioner. As I mentioned before, Trua organizes rabbis across the US and Canada. We work in coalitions with in interfaith coalitions and secular coalitions on issues like incarceration, immigration, worker justice. And we also work for the human rights of both Israelis and Palestinians, just to be really clear about where we stand as an organization on that particular issue, since I know it will come up. So we are a human rights organization. We start from the position that every single person deserves human rights as encoded in international law. And in the case of Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories, that means for us that every single person on that slice of land deserves the same basic human rights, which include self-determination, it includes freedom of movement, it includes the right to citizenship in a country. Don't all have I don't have the right to citizenship in, let's say, Denmark, though that sounds nice, but everybody has the right to have citizenship in some country. And for us, that means working for two states, which we still think is the solution that is the most likely to allow for the human rights of both peoples. So of course, if the people on the ground come up with something else that will guarantee human rights, then that is fantastic. So that's where we stand. And that also includes working against occupation. Occupation itself is not a human rights violation, but many of the ways in which Israel is carrying out the occupation do violate international human rights. So that's where we stand, just so you know, which means that we work in lots of different places, both in the Jewish community, in the progressive community. So a few things that I've learned along the way. The first is that nobody understands who the Jews are. I think that's also true of Jews. This is a long-standing issue, right? Are we a religion? Are we an ethnicity? Are we a people? What does people even mean? Right? We don't very neatly fit into a nice box as determined really by Western Protestantism. And so it's very confusing who Jews are. And that particularly comes up around questions of Israel, the connection to land, right? Because if you want to say, well, Jews are just a religion, then, well, what do you need with this slice of land? But of course, we know that Jews are not only a religion. If Jews were only a religion, then it wouldn't make sense for somebody to say, well, I'm an atheist, but I'm Jewish. But of course, we know that that is a totally normal thing for Jews to say, that people can say, I don't do anything. I don't observe any Jewish law. I don't believe in God. I don't go to synagogue. And I feel really deeply that I'm Jewish because, of course, it's not just about a faith practice. It's also a people and an ethnicity and a land and a heritage and culture and food and languages and a bunch of things that I didn't mention. Okay, so that's very confusing. The second thing is that nobody understands anti-Semitism. This, of course, includes Jews. There's a lot of confusion about what anti-Semitism is. And some of that stems from something, I want to go back to something that Natan said about your student, I think your Czech student, saying, well, Jews are really successful. And something that's very confusing about anti-Semitism, as opposed to other bigotries, is many other bigotries are quantifiable. If you want to know about sexism, you can, for example, count how many women are in CEO positions in major corporations or on corporate boards, or you can count how many people of color are in those positions, or you can look at university, right? There's certain things that you can count. But when it comes to anti-Semitism, it's not quantifiable in the same way. Of course, there is, history, certainly, like Natan said, a long history of Jews being shut out from certain professions or land ownership or all sorts of being able to live in certain places. And in the United States, we have the history of quotas and restrictive covenants. And we do have that history in the United States, but for the most part right now, when we're talking about anti-Semitism, we can't go around and say, well, how many Jews are in university? Because guess what? It's going to be more than 2% of the population. It's going to be disproportionate. And some of this is, anti-Semitism, as Natan was saying, very much depends on being able to point to Jews in high positions and say, oh, look at that person, they're a banker. Look at that person, they are the head of the Federal Reserve, right? Look at these very prominent people who, especially if they're connected to money or if they're perceived as being connected to power, right? That's something that is held up as really that helps to, for some people, justify anti-Semitism. So it's very confusing because anti-Semitism doesn't necessarily show up in the same ways that other bigotries show up. The third thing that people really don't understand is the history of anti-Semitism. That is why it is really important for us to understand that very long history of anti-Semitism and the different ways in which it's manifested over the years. For something that I keep being surprised every time I learn this, but I keep learning it, that for many people, many non-Jews in the United States, anti-Semitism began and ended with the Holocaust. So I have this one experience that really sticks out for me. After Charlottesville, I was talking to a reporter from a secular publication, non-Jewish reporter, not a Jewish publication. And she was trying to understand what had happened in the Nazi march in Charlottesville. And she said to me, I just don't understand. I mean, the Holocaust was so long ago. How come there's still anti-Semitism? And for Jews, I think that's kind of a nonsensical question, but I do think that perhaps because we've done a good job of Holocaust education in this country, that the way that many people have processed the history is there was nothing, nothing, nothing. The Nazis dropped out of outer space, made the Holocaust, created the Holocaust, and then somehow, I don't know, evaporated back into outer space. And so it's confusing when anti-Semitism reappears. So that's all background for saying that a lot of the work that we do at Trua is really explaining anti-Semitism to our partners, sometimes in Jewish communities, certainly outside of the Jewish community. For us this year, that's included congressional staff, young congressional staff. It's included hospital chaplains. It's included partner organizations in the progressive space, trainings both in English and in Spanish. And again, we find over and over that that for many people, this is really new information, that the history of anti-Semitism, the very long history of anti-Semitism. So the next thing that I want to say that I just hinted at is that when we do work on fighting anti-Semitism, it's really important that we do it in relationship. And it's really important that we do it in the context of fighting racism, fighting homophobia, fighting sexism, fighting other kinds of bigotries. There's no separate piece. There's no way to end anti-Semitism in the US or anywhere else and outside of the context of ending other kinds of bigotries. Of course, do want to say that, of course, many people occupy many different kinds of identities, right? There's, of course, Jews who are not white. There's Jews who are women. There's Jews who are gay, right? Like nobody, very few people just fit into one box. And it's really important in progressive communities that our partners are seeing that Jewish communities are out there and we're both fighting other kinds of bigotries. And then, of course, we are speaking up. I absolutely don't want to say that we should be quiet when we see examples of anti-Semitism come up. We have to speak up because if Jews don't speak up, then nobody's going to understand how to fight anti-Semitism in the same way that women had to speak up about sexism before men learned how to speak up about it. Okay, then I want to say one more thing before I talk about Israel, which of course is the most complicated part and something that we'll probably end up talking about a lot in questions and answers. I just want to unpack this question of whether there's right-wing anti-Semitism and left-wing anti-Semitism. So it's true that anti-Semitism does show up differently on the right and on the left. On the right, it shows up often, as Natan said, in language about globalists, in conspiracy theories. We've seen that certainly a lot as white Christian nationalism has come out of the shadows in the last number of years. It's much more associated with violence, as the ADL has reported. The vast majority, almost all of the violent incidents of anti-Semitism in this country have been on the right. That is not always true in other places, in Europe, for example, but that's true. That's been true in the United States. And in Israel, and on the left, it often does come out through Israel, through seeing Israel as some kind of outsized power, the Zionist forces, et cetera, et cetera. And then there's also ways, but I do want to break down this dichotomy because there's ways that anti-Semitism emerges. It's not about the right or the left. So the question of money, for example, this idea that Jews are associated with money, that's also something that Natan mentioned, is something that we see show up really across the board because it is so baked into the history of anti-Semitism. Stereotypes about Jewish women, for example, that's not necessarily right or left, that's a stereotype. And then places, there's been, over the last number of years, there's been a number of cases where there's been, for example, anti-Semitic street harassment in Haredi neighborhoods, particularly places like Brooklyn, anti-Semitism by Black Hebrews, the shooting in Jersey City, the murders in the kosher grocery store. And something that often happens in those incidents is that the perception is, well, that's left-wing anti-Semitism, and it's labeled left-wing anti-Semitism if the perpetrators are Black or Latino. But it's not necessarily politically left anti-Semitism because of the identity of the perpetrator. Certainly the people who carried out the attacks in Jersey City were not on the left. Kanye West is not on the left. And in Brooklyn, the situation that's causing the violence there is there's just a very long, complicated history. Again, it's anti-Semitism. There's no excuse for that kind of harassment or violence, but you can't just write it off as, oh, that's the left, that's the right. So I just want to really problematize that sense of all anti-Semitism can fall into one category or another. It's much more complicated than that. Okay, I'm probably basically out of time. So I'm going to say a few things about Israel, and I'm sure we're going to talk about it. Israel is the most complicated issue. It's the most contested. It's the place where we find, on the one hand, there's some people, mostly in the Jewish community, who say anti-Zionism is 100% anti-Semitism, boycotting Israel is 100% anti-Semitism, who will cast really most criticism of Israel into the category of anti-Semitism. There's people on the left who say, oh, well, I'm just criticizing Israel, so it can't possibly be anti-Semitism. Both of those positions are way too simplistic. When we think about where the line is between what's criticism of Israel and what's anti-Semitism, there's a lot of gray area, but a few things that I want to say. The first thing that I want to say is that Israel is a country, which we sometimes forget. It's a country like any other country. It's a member of the United Nations. It's subject to international human rights law. It violates that international human rights law like every other country, right? Every country is on a continuum of where it sits and how well it's doing or how badly it's doing. And it can be criticized like any country. And we sometimes forget that because for American Jews, Israel is sometimes so tied up in our personal identity that when we're talking about Israel, we're not actually talking about Israel, the country, we're talking about all of our emotions and identity questions and everything about Israel. And so when we're asking questions like, is this anti-Semitic or is it criticism of Israel? The real question is, well, is this something that you would say about a country, any country? And the places where, so that means, first of all, like you can boycott, boycotting Israel is not necessarily anti-Semitism. There is anti-Semitism for sure inside the BDS movement, but Trua, for example, supported what's now a law that bans, a US law that bans imports from the Xinjiang region of China because it's produced under forced labor by Uyghurs, right? That is a boycott, or we're all boycotting Russia at this point. One can boycott countries. It's not necessarily anti-Semitism if one makes a political decision to boycott Israel. I'm not boycotting Israel, Trua is not boycotting Israel, and it is a position about a country, not about a people. Criticism of Israel, even if you don't agree with it, somebody can have very harsh criticism that we might think is wrong. We might think it's offensive, but if it's criticism of Israel as a country, it's not anti-Semitism. When it does cross over to anti-Semitism, it's in situations like denying the Jewish history in Israel, language like the alleged temple, or saying that today's Jews are not real Jews. So buying into old anti-Semitic theories that we're all we're all descendants of Khazar converts, for example, right? That we're not real Jews. So that's anti-Semitism, saying, as Natan said, that Israel or Zionists have outsized influence in the world, suggesting that all of the Jews in Israel should go back to where they came from, as though that were even a possibility. So things that take this beyond beyond what you would say about a country, about any other country. And I just want to end by saying that it's really important for us in the Jewish community to be really clear about what those lines are, because there is anti-Semitism in the BDS movement, there's anti-Semitism in the progressive world surrounding Israel, and we have to call it out. And when we call out criticism of Israel that doesn't actually cross that line, it makes it harder to call out anti-Semitism when it really arises. So it's not an easy line to draw, but it is an important one. I'll just stop there.
And now please welcome Shane Burley.
Thanks so much. Now I can hear myself. Thanks so much for kind of allowing me on this panel to talk about this. If anything, I'm a journalist of social movements, so I wanted to talk about what anti-Semitism has to do with social movements and if those things have something to do with one another. So I wanted to start with two caveats, basically two things I recommend people avoid. This is probably true of all anti-Semitism in general, but it's especially true when we're talking about anti-Semitism on the left. The first thing is hyperbole. There's a lot of rhetoric that we'll often talk about. There's anti-Semitism in the extremes of the left and the extremes of the right. This assumes that there's two sides that have equal problem in this, and that is factually untrue. The greatest statistical threat to Jews and all marginalized people is white Christian nationalism, point blank, full stop. And so we need to talk about the left anti-Semitism not because it's the worst, but because it's not. But because it's the place where we should actually have buy-in to confront these issues. The other thing to avoid is what I call eternalism, which is a way of framing anti-Semitism as though it's inevitable, natural, and normative, that it's just something broken in Gentile society. But I'll contend that it is not. It is actually something that's the result of inequalities, oppression, both systemic and interpersonal, and something we can do something about. I don't enter into this to give up ground and say, hey, I'll just mitigate this, we won't be able to really solve it. No, I actually want to solve this. And so I think when we're going into this, we should actually shoot to say, no, we can actually unseat this in the left. We can confront it and do something about it. So I take an approach on this I call a social movement approach. I sort of wrote down a quickie definition. So building on international traditions of anti-racist social movements, this approach to anti-Semitism centers community engagement, activism, and solidarity. By creating bridges between Jewish and non-Jewish communities to engage in organizing campaigns, we build the muscle necessary to make real change. The goal of this is to build an alliance across communities, to have Jews engage with non-Jews around the issues that affect both of us. And the question of whether or not a social movement can do something about this is a question of where anti-Semitism comes from. Where are the roots of it? So when I'm writing about this, I often use kind of wonky term, structural anti-Semitism, comes from a Marxist scholar, Moshe Pistone. But it talks about the ways in which anti-Semitism is embedded in Western, not just systems of thought, but the actual structures that we deal with. So I borrowed this quote from a couple of colleagues of mine, Gina Green and Shara Goldsvik. They run a kind of progressive consulting firm. They say anti-Semitism is part of the machinery of division and fear created and used for specific political and material gain. The point they're making is that anti-Semitism is part of how authoritarians, demagogues, systems of inequality break down people's ability to solve problems. By using conspiracy theories, by pointing at people who aren't responsible, it actually diverts responsibility away from those who are. So the point is that education and a lot of the interventions you find in the anti-Semitism space can't work on their own because they don't confront systems of power. This is not simply about misunderstandings. There are people actively engaged in propagating conspiracy theories, anti-Semitic tropes, and they do it for a specific reason. And so for the left, if the left legitimately wants to confront power, this is part of how power operates. And so confronting that is part of what they need to do to actually make a dent. And this gets to this term that we've heard a lot about called intersectionality. This is about how different forms of oppression interact, both on an individual level, but also on a societal level. So I want to give two examples of how anti-Semitism interacts with other forms of oppression. And it gives us a little bit of what the stake is for the left and for all communities. So people probably remember a horrific shooting in Buffalo pretty recently. It's in a largely Black neighborhood. I used to live up just right near there. So it's at a grocery store in a Black neighborhood. A shooter went in with the explicit purpose to kill Black people. They wrote a manifesto and said, I want to come in here to murder Black people. But when you read the manifesto, there's something really particularly interesting. They say that this is one battle in a war not between whites and Black folks, but between Gentiles and Jews. What he is explaining is that Jews, he believes, are controlling Black folks to erase white people, white genocide conspiracy theory. So the construct of his anti-Blackness was built foundationally on anti-Semitism. It required it. One thing required the other. Another example is a lot of these anti-trans healthcare bills that are going through. There's been, I think, about 135 I saw recently at the state level, local level. If you read the text of the bill, the actual bills themselves, you'll find something really interesting. They blame this on Soros, they blame it on Rothschilds, globalists, international financiers. The threat they believe that trans people are is based entirely on conspiracy theories that come from anti-Semitic roots. So the point being here is that anti-Semitism, it does not just harm Jews, it harms everyone that both wants to solve problems, but also faces marginalization. A colleague of mine at the University of Washington, Dan Berger, wrote this really great article right about the time Trump was elected, where he said, clearly anti-Semitism is at the roots of the MAGA movement, except it's not primarily wielded at Jews. It's wielded at refugees coming over the border. It's wielded at women trying to get abortions. It's wielded at trans kids trying to get healthcare. Anti-Semitic conspiracy theories are mobilized against entire communities to attack them at the same time as they are harming Jews. So the reality is that we have a stake in building these alliances, and we must actually do it. If we want a social movement that gets masses of people in to put the pressure that we need, we are going to have to look into the left and confront it. So I kind of identified 5 things that I think are reasonable interventions. These are just 5 of what could be many of them. The first is that I actually think this is where education does a good job. I think education on people who want to be educated actually does a pretty good effort. So I interviewed, I'll leave their name out of this because we didn't talk about this in advance. It's a popular progressive Jewish organization that does a training on anti-Semitism, and they do a pamphlet, they're very good. So when they were developing the training, they invited a bunch of coalition partners in to take the training and give them feedback. They wanted this to be good. And so as the organizers explained to me, then the coalition partners, and just to be clear, this is major unions and organizations in New York, said the most anti-Semitic things you could imagine. How do we talk about the real estate market when we know that Jews run the real estate market? How do we talk about Wall Street when we know that Jews are disproportionately working on it? So the organizers had a choice. I can kick them out, you cross the line, or we can do something about this here. I can tell you you're wrong and explain why and invest in that. Because they had the relationships and because the people were saying, we want to be here for this, we are showing up for this, they did that. And they made this a long-term education battle and worked with them. And all those organizations kept that relationship. They take the training out into the community now, into their union members, things like that. They are engaged in it. And so they took it seriously. Now, I don't want to be Pollyanna about this. When you confront people on these things, it's not like they're naturally going to say, great, I'm glad you called me out for this. How wonderful. But if we want to actually see change in these spaces, we have to invest in people changing. Another example I wrote down, which I think is really interesting, and people probably have mixed feelings about the group, but if not now, which is the Palestine Solidarity Organization, they started doing a training on anti-Semitism, not because they do anti-Semitism work, but because anti-Semitism is a hot conversation in Palestine Solidarity circles. So they figured we better get our ducks in a row, train people on it, have a stake in this. And then after doing that, they started participating in different things. Like, for example, they were one of the only Jewish groups that was at Charlottesville protesting Unite the Right. So they were actually decided to be involved in that. There's another kind of concept I parsed out, and part of this is about we need to have actual working relationships across communities if we want to actually confront issues. And so I wrote down this concept of joint safety plans. So people know this building was vandalized with anti-Semitic graffiti, right? So was Beth Israel downtown. Well, shocker, the same person who did that tried to set fire to a mosque. The reality is that we actually have a shared experiences with Muslims in the community. Are we building a shared relationship from that? What kind of shared safety options are there? And then what could emerge from that? What could happen if we actually built those relationships? I interviewed folks in what was called the Clergy Collective in Charlottesville. This was started by folks at Beth Israel. So it was clergy at Beth Israel and then a number of the Black churches. So in advance of Unite the Right in 2017, there was a Klan rally and there were some other white nationalist rallies. So they built this with the idea that when they're coming for both of our communities. So we better both be here to support each other. And so that's what they did. So the Black churches would mobilize and help do security on the high holy days, vice versa. Beth Israel would mobilize congregants to go out to Black churches. And not only were these safer communities, and also outside of just bringing in cops and armed security and things like that, but they also had real working relationships. And so a lot of the folks of color in those communities talked a lot about how they were starting to understand anti-Semitism because they were having these conversations through a working relationship. They weren't just being kind of talked to about it. I wrote down this term accomplices, which I like a lot, which is an alternative to an ally. An ally is a very nice person who does something to support me because it's a good thing to do. An accomplice has their foot in this. They have a stake in it beyond just supporting me. When we're talking to folks, and particularly folks on the left, I think it's important to confront them about how does this affect you? How does anti-Semitism affect you, including with non-Jews? Does it destroy your movement's ability to figure out who's in power and what to do about problems? Does it help mobilize anti-Blackness in the community? Does it attack trans healthcare? How is it affecting folks? Because when that happens, people stay in this for the long haul. They don't just come to help me out. They actually come in to help themselves, and that's where you build a real movement. Accountability is going to be important. I hate to say this, but we will probably have to be the ones that hold people accountable. And I don't mean like Jewish leadership somewhere else. I mean people in this room. Like having these conversations is probably going to be important, but making sure that they happen in regular frequency. I just did a presentation at the Hate Studies Conference, and a woman from the ADL sat through my presentation very nicely. I could tell she didn't love it, but she was there. And then at the end, she said, Shane, wow, you spent an hour and 20 minutes. You haven't mentioned anti-Zionism once. Let's avoid that. Let's talk about these things. These are going to be important. And it's going to be important to parse those things out and put their cards on the table. We're not just there to win points. We're there to build real relationships. And so confronting those things, having a no tolerance attitude for things like conspiracy theories before they get threatening, and setting basically an agenda. This is what we expect from the space. Jewish-only spaces are also important too, both inside organizations and organizationally of our own. We need to have the space to actually develop consciousness about what's happening in our communities if we want to be in those communities. And this is tough because for the last 20 or 30 years, Jews in the left have not spoken on Jewish issues that affect them very much. That's historically a big piece of what had developed the Jewish left, but it is not since the 80s and forward, and that's a thing that's starting to change. So we want to have those spaces where you can reflect. And the reality is that anti-Semitism is primarily a threat to Jewish particularity, the continuity of our existence, either materially, attacks on us as people, or attacks on our ability to do Jewish things, and we want to have spaces for those things to flourish. I wanted to close with what I think is a cute anecdote. I was just in Crown Heights a couple of months ago at 770, which is the Chabad World Headquarters, and I was interviewing a number of folks there and putting on tefillin with them. And I spent time with one rabbi, and I was asking him, how do you understand anti-Semitism? Is it a perennial problem? Is it like a theological problem? Is it, Esau hates Jacob? Is that how? And he's like, no, not at all. No one is born anti-Semitic. This is just the consequences of a broken world. And I sort of took that to mean that it's the same consequences of other forms of brokenness, oppression, inequality, things that we're kind of striving against. We just receive it as anti-Semitism because we're Jews. And then when those forces come, they come for us in that way. Another person from Chabad, more of a scholar, Eli Rubin, when I was talking to him about this, he sort of expressed, I have a little disinterest in this concept of anti-Semitism, which is interesting because he lives just really a few blocks from Tree of Life. He walks right past there on to Shul, Morris Tallis, just a couple of days after the massacre, on his walk to Shul for Kabbalat Shabbat. And so I asked him, why is this not important to you? And he's like, well, Shane, this isn't very Jewish, is it? And then he went on to say, what I'm concerned about is what causes anti-Semitism and what I can build in community that's the opposite of that. What builds connection? What builds mutual aid? What gives people lives worth living? So the question he wants us to ask is, what is it that's bringing people to this? What's alienated in people's lives? What is missing? And what can we do to repair it? And I think as Jews, we have something really specific to offer. It's a tradition that is based entirely on that mission, Tikkun Olam, of healing the world. So to paraphrase Chabad's final Rebbe, Menachem Mendel Schneerson, God created humans to do the work of perfecting and healing the world and himself. So in essence, part of what it means to be Jews is to fight against anti-Semitism because it's built into our Jewishness, our chosen mission to heal the world. So a big piece of this fighting anti-Semitism, and I think what Rubin was getting at, is that what we can do is to be very, very Jewish. So, thanks.
Now please welcome Rabbi Ariel Stone.
And that's such a great segue. So about 15 years ago, picture this. Chabad, local Chabad, started doing Hanukkah at a Trailblazers game. Remember that? Did you go to one of those maybe even? Yeah? So at halftime, or whatever they call it in basketball, they brought out this humongous menorah, and Shir Tikva was maybe 4 or 5 years old, and we're like, all, yay, let's do it. We were maybe 100 families, and we had 80 people show up just from us, parents and children. And the teenagers all got together and sat over in the bleachers by themselves because, they're kids. And at halftime, they started cheering way loud, "We're the Hebes, we're the Hebes." And all the parents were going, "Not so loud." Last Sunday, our congregation was privileged to welcome a refugee, Jewish refugee from Ukraine. I had to try to explain to one of our number on the committee why he shouldn't show up with a Ukrainian flag. A Jew is not a Ukrainian. Ukrainians made the best concentration camp guards. It's one of the common things people will say, whether or not it's true. I made the mistake of getting married the day before St. Patty's Day in Chicago. Everything was green. Lots of people who were Irish and lots more people who weren't Irish were wearing buttons that said, "Kiss me, I'm Irish." And I thought to myself, can you ever imagine a world in which people would wear a button that says, "Kiss me, I'm Jewish"? Jews and non-Jews? Nurses at our local Providence system, and I don't think it's limited there, but this is the story I know, have been known to discourage Jewish mothers giving birth from waiting until the 8th day to circumcise their child. Oh, honey, that's barbaric. That's not important. If you're going to do it, you should do it as a medical thing and do it right now in the hospital. What do all things have in common? It's a complicated inheritance. Anti-Semitism expresses itself in many ways that are not easily identifiable as left or right. Cultural appropriation, for example. BLT on a bagel? Tattoos in Hebrew. Someone coming up to me one day and saying, "You're a rabbi, can you tell me if this is correct?" Christian satyrs. Messianic Jews. Thinking about anti-Semitism specifically on the left, and I agree, Shane, with you so much that I want to tackle it on the left because these are my siblings. These are the people I march with in the streets. These are the people I want to be understood by, to be seen by. Anti-Semitism on the left, in my experience, in the streets, requires that if Jews would be members of liberation movements, we must be willing to undergo a process that I would like to call dismemberment. We are outside easy categories of thought and experience. Our very existence disrupts binary ways of thinking, which is a huge irony in a movement that honors non-binary identities. We must assimilate to be accepted. Have you heard that one before? I want to talk about erasure, and I am deliberately using terms that are current in leftist circles where I run. One of the immortal slogans of the movement for Black Lives is "Say their name." And in this way, those of us who are marching declare that every life is precious and indispensable. You will see our commitment to this idea in the names that are etched on our entrance. Numbers will leave us numb. We must recognize the uniqueness of each human life. This call for respect for each human life is a fundamental rule in Judaism, in which we say that each life is worth the life of the world. On the left in Portland, Jews are not welcome to bring their names with them, much less our world and worldview. I want to be very clear here. I am not setting up a Black versus Jewish dichotomy. I bow to the leadership of the Black community in creating the movement that I am part of. But for many who are part of that movement, Jews must fit a predetermined mold which requires us to disown parts of ourselves in order to be acceptable. Ideologically, we must declare our rejection of Israel and Zionism at the door. Other ways in which we must be willing to forego our own uniqueness include two great signs of Jewish identity, kashrut and Shabbat. Leftists will make you a vegan, gluten-free, salt-free, cruelty-free burrito and deliver it to you for free. But if you're going to observe Pesach, bring your own snacks to the revolution, which will probably start on a Friday night. I'm not saying we have to all agree with each other on everything. Justice is not about agreement. I can fight for your rights even if you don't like me, because everybody deserves their rights. But there's an irony in this for Jews, which is really interesting to me. So try this out for size. In Europe, Jews were held apart as less than human for many generations because we were not part of Christianity, which was the organizing principle of European existence. And I speak here of the Ashkenazi experience because that is normative in the United States, and I'm aware of the fact that that is not the global Jewish experience, but it tends to color what we experience in the United States. In Europe, we were seen as culturally other and separated. In the United States, we are seen as culturally other and separated, but for different reasons. In the United States, we are not of a different color than the norm, the majority, the oppressor. There's a whole different measuring stick for how Jews are different. But if safety is defined as blending in, and my grandparents were assimilated Western European Jews who thought of themselves as Germans first, and were as stunned as Anne Frank's father when service in World War I didn't mean anything in the 1930s. That was a specific kind of marginalized experience, which is not the same as what we experience here. Although the Jewish stratagem for acceptance is to blend in order to be accepted. The irony here is that we thought we would find safety based on our European experience in the United States by not appearing different. So we dropped all of our culturally specific practices in order to be safe. And now we want to be seen and heard and respected as different, but we don't even know who we are to answer the question of how we're different. White people insist to black people, I'm not white, I'm Jewish. You look white. Tell me how you're Jewish. Well, I don't know. I've spent my whole life trying to be white so I could be safe. Jews are a marginalized minority. Do you remember the courageous conversations that were big a few years ago? I went to one here in Portland and I got shot way down because the conversation was black and white, and I mean that literally. My sense of self, created by an inheritance over many centuries of persecution and massacre as a race which was in Europe seen as other, had no room to be heard. We didn't fit the paradigm. W.B. Du Bois went to Warsaw in 1949. W.E.B. Du Bois, the famous, the great, the amazing civil rights leader. He went to Warsaw, Poland, and stood in the middle of the rubble that was left of the Warsaw Ghetto in 1949, and he said, "I have seen something of human upheaval in this world. The screams and shots of a race riot in Atlanta, the marching of the Ku Klux Klan, the threat of courts and police, the neglect and destruction of human habitation. But nothing in my wildest imagination was equal to what I saw in Warsaw." Du Bois said the experience helped him to emerge from a certain social provincialism into a broader conception of what the fight against race segregation, religious discrimination, and the oppression by wealth had to become if civilization was going to triumph and broaden in the world. All around him, there was complete and total waste, and one monument to the Warsaw Ghetto fighters. For him, as he wrote, it turned him from someone who believed Jews were victims to someone who was a fellow fighter against oppression. Just as Black people in the United States had rebelled against slavery and Jim Crow. And if you'd like to read the whole article, it's in The Atlantic. What America has to learn from German coming to terms with the Holocaust. American Black writer. I bring up Du Bois, again, not because this is Black versus Jewish, but because I admire, respect, and walk with Black leadership in this community every time I'm out on the streets. And we have so much in common. If you have not read Eric Ward's article, Skin in the Game, he understands this, and I think we have to understand in the same way that he speaks to his people and says, hey, their liberation is tied up with ours. We have to say the same thing to them, to ourselves, about them. Our liberation is tied up with theirs, not at our expense. And this is what we need to learn from the Black community. Our names are equally as important. We ourselves must know what we are representing, who we are. It does us no good, we've discovered, to our great shock, blending in and trying to be like everyone else. It does not work. It has not worked, it will not work. If they're gonna hate you, you might as well know what they hate. You might as well stand for it. I wanted to end by giving you a couple of examples. If I can find the flipping thing. I can't, I don't have it with me. Couple of examples that I will dredge up from my memory right now of a list of anti-Semitic comments. I wonder how many of them you recognize. Jews will not replace us. Jews out of Palestine, out of Israel. Jews go to Palestine, which was the graffiti on the walls of Europe in the 1930s. Jews run the banks. Jews have horns. These don't belong to one side or the other. But we have to know who we are. We have to know about the Kishinev pogrom. We have to know about our own epigenetic trauma and respect it in order to meet others. And when we ask them to hear us, have something to say.
Okay, thank you all. And now we're going to open it up to you, the audience. Raise your hand if you have a question or comment.
Thank you to the speakers and presenters. This was wonderful. I feel that it's important to add to this conversation a couple of points, and so I'll do that and then I will pass it on. One of the things that's going to be absolutely vital is to clean our own house. And what I mean by that is that somebody, I can't remember who, I'm sorry, talked about the discomfort in feeling like there was a way that you had to let go of things or not be things or silence or erase things when you walk into a space where maybe the discussion is racism or black versus white. Imagine what that is like if you are a Black Jew or an Asian Jew or a Latin Jew. We need to take care of our own community in the way that we need to bring and welcome and connect and give leadership to Jews of color. Then we are not having a conversation anymore about them and us, but we build from within us what is a fairer and more reasonable and truer definition of what it looks like. Just what it looks like even, but it will be so much more to be a Jew. The other point that I want to make is that, and this is my personal belief, but I think I'm not alone, that Judaism, its survival, and it is in part due to the tension between, okay, the big thing is we should survive. And we live in a space that has historically, for a very long time, said to us two things. One, the only way to survive is to assimilate. And two, the only way to survive is to hold fast to who we are. And depending on which of those things you are acculturated to believe, you look one way when you walk down the street, and you look a different way if you don't. It may be the reason we have survived so long, because we have both of these things going on at once. But each one of us individually has to unpack those things and look at the cost to each individual and our community to assimilate to the point where the cost is too expensive. But I still think we need assimilation at the same time. Thank you.
Thank you. Does anyone want to
Can we collect a
respond?
couple of comments?
Hi, thank you. This was very interesting. I wanted to echo what the previous person had mentioned. I wasn't going to mention this, but because I'm the parent of 3 Chinese Jews, it's very personal to me because they experience anti-Semitism and racism in a different way than everyone sitting here. And I thought that maybe there might be some thoughts or things that you all could suggest in terms of how, so I have a 19, 20, and 21-year-old, but I also work with middle school and high school students and their families. And all of this anti-Semitism and racism and transphobia and everything you've all discussed exists in schools, in the hallways. It exists on social media second by second. And it's wonderful to think that, maybe as organizations, we can all come together and educate, but having to have conversations on a daily basis with my own children or with the 7th grader I'm tutoring or with the parent whose child is a person of color and they've heard something racist and they've heard something anti-Semitic and everything is anti-Israel. And I'm just wondering if any of you have any thoughts about or know of any ways that this might be being addressed in our community or in other organizations, like some actual things that I could take with me that might be of assistance to Jews of color, as well as other, Jews in Portland, anyways, that are, teens dealing with all this.
Actually, I think you did.
No, you need a mic.
All right, I have two criticisms and a comment. My first comment is that about once a year, there's a presentation like this, and that's fine, but these presentations need to be in left-wing spaces, and the people here don't need to be Jews. There's, in my opinion, no point of talking about this issue in a Jewish space to Jews. Those are not the people who need to know about left-wing anti-Semitism. Two, I just have criticisms of the speakers. It's Du Bois, it's not Dubois. And the PSU professor, I have a number of criticisms, but the first off, that the idea that Jews, it was a medieval slander that Jews are the moneylenders has been challenged in recent scholarship. Peter Staudenmeier talks about this. Scholarship appears to show, I'm not a scholar of this period, that this is an idea that arose after in modern secularized Judaism. It makes a lot of sense because that's the period that anti-Semitism becomes associated with abstractions, with media, with finance. In the Middle Ages, Jews are associated with anti-Christian things like, poisoning wells and murdering babies and desecrating, the hosts. The other thing, though, I think you misread Marx. I mean, there's a lot of discussion about this in Marxist circles. You even read people like David Hirsch, who's a critical left-wing anti-Semitism and a Marxist or a former Marxist. In that passage that you read from On the Jewish Question, Marx does not associate Jews with capitalism, and this is a bigger problem with your analysis. He associates Jews with money and with haggling and these kinds of things. An actual Marxist critique of global capital is an anti-Semitic critique. It shows that capitalism does not revolve on money. Money is thousands of years old. Markets are thousands of years old. A Marxist understanding militates against a anti-Semitic understanding about the role of finance capital and the role that Jews would have in that. So I think, and you're tying that to things like questions of globalists. This is, again, not a dialogue you see in the left. After Seattle in 1999, there was a clear difference between talking about globalization and globalists. If you see people talking about globalists, that's like an immediate trigger that this is some, at best, kooky stuff you'd see on Global Research or Counterpunch, and at worst, an actual entryist. So again, I think that these conversations should be had with non-Jews in left-wing spaces, in summary.
Any comments from the panel?
So to sort of pick up on the thread from the first two speakers, in doing, I've been working on a book on anti-Semitism for about 3 years, and we spent, I think, the majority of time talking with biracial Jews and Jews of color around intersections and the concept of intersections. And right now there's kind of a growing world of folks that are creating specifically organizations for Jews of color to confront issues like this. And one of the problems that I think we should have conversations like this, but one of the problems about separating this conversation from the larger issues that it touches is that it sort of privileges it as a separate. Anti-Semitism does functionally work separate, but it is not separate from those other experiences and those other systems of power, and we need to bring them back there as much as possible. In doing the book, I talked with a lot of folks who debate. For folks who aren't on the inside of the stuff, definitions of anti-Semitism are hot political debates. And so I was talking with one scholar who had co-wrote the Jerusalem Declaration, and her argument was actually we shouldn't even define anti-Semitism because we should be defining what's coming in. People are experiencing things as a result of a Christian society, homogenous white society, and the pressures of that. So I think getting folks in those organizations and having Jews of color lead those conversations is going to be essential, not just for some moral vision, but for strategically for us to actually functionally do something about that. So I agree, there are a number of organizations, I can talk to you afterwards about it too. There are a number of organizations that do some of that work. Some are better than others, but I think that's the sort of direction of what the next 10 to 15 years, specifically of Jewish left organizations that want to get people involved in that work.
Rabbi Jill, I wonder if you would like to have a piece of this.
Sure. I'll say a couple of things in response to, sorry, I didn't catch the names of the speakers, of the people who made comments. So first of all, the speaker who noted that we can't just think about Jews as white. Of course not. I mean, I think one of the things that I said before is, of course, Jews fall into lots of overlapping categories. Many people fall into many overlapping categories, and it's really crucially important that we hear the voices of Jews of color who speak about their experiences, both with racism and with anti-Semitism, and the intersections and all the ways that that plays out. So that is really crucially important to just break through those binaries, that because Jews are not all white, certainly. In terms of the talking in left-wing spaces, I mean, that's, our organization, many other organizations are working with our coalition partners in left-wing spaces to learn about anti-Semitism, to talk about anti-Semitism, talk about racism, et cetera. It's really important for us that we're doing that in the context of relationship and not just by yelling at each other on op-ed pages, which usually doesn't change anybody's mind. And then the person who asked for just really practical suggestions. So I'll give one thing that's very practical. Trez partnered with a group called Right to Be, which does training about harassment, about how to respond to harassment, different kinds of harassment, whether it's racism or sexism, et cetera. But we've partnered with them on a training about anti-Semitism. And it's, you can just look online. There was one that just happened a couple of weeks ago. I'm not sure when the next one is, but you can look online, either on the TRA website or Right to Be. And that training that we developed together goes through a short history of anti-Semitism, understanding what anti-Semitism is, and then gives some really practical skills for, well, what do you do if you're walking down the street and you see somebody being harassed for being Jewish? What do you do if you're in a social situation, somebody tells a Jewish joke or a racist joke, right? These are transferable skills. And so that's certainly a very practical thing that I think kids can go through to talk about, well, what do you do if you're hanging out with your friends and somebody says something really offensive, or somebody puts something offensive on Snapchat or Instagram or wherever? What do you do in that situation? So you can definitely look out for that training.
So I'll just respond about the historical points that you made. I'd love to get the reference that you mentioned about Jewish moneylenders. I'm not aware of it, and all I can say is that I've engaged, studied multiple documents that talk about very real moneylenders in medieval countries, and there's lots of evidence about that. So I'd love to see something that that says it's essentially an invention of the modern period, because that's interesting. As far as the point about Marx, I do take your point that probably the way I presented Marx here in this particular context was oversimplified. There's a long discussion to be had about exactly what Marx meant in that essay. And as you probably know, there's been a lot of ink spilled about, what that essay really meant to do, what's its relationship to anti-Semitism, and so on and so forth. I guess the way I would rephrase it or recouch it is that regardless of how we might interpret what he said within his larger oeuvre, within his larger discussion of capital and the role of capital, I think the point that I was trying to make in that particular quote, and the quote is, as when you hear it, it's difficult to hear as a Jew, even if we know that he's not talking about Jews per se. And my point, I think, was that there are certain implications or certain consequences, let's say long-term consequences, of that kind of language in as influential an oeuvre as Marx's was, that has to have some sort of impact on the movement as a whole. And I specifically, I made sure to say that by no means is Marxism as a way of thinking or as a way of perceiving the world or as a movement anti-Semitic as a whole. It's just that that kind of wording, that kind of that equation of Judaism with money inevitably has certain consequences, even, regardless of how we could understand what Marx meant in the original. That's basically what I meant to say, and I hope that does make some sense.
So if I pick up on this for a second, I think there's actually an interesting allegory. There's a scholar, Marcel Stotzler, you know Marcel, who writes about the difference between sort of anti-Semitism of the left, which is like left-wing theories that are foundationally built on an anti-Semitic worldview, and anti-Semitism on the left, which is anti-Semitism kind of, or leftist theorists that sort of pick up on anti-Semitic stereotypes in their work. And I think that's actually a pretty clear example of that kind of second type. And you find that a lot in basically socialist writings of that period. The Enzo Traverso book talks, kind of chronicles that. And so I think that, and this is actually something that I think is relevant now because you see this in sort of modern theorists. I think there was a book by Abdullah Öcalan recently, that basically assumes that like some anti-Semitic stereotypes and conspiracy theories are probably true, and then kind of just moves along through that. So, but rather than building his entire worldview on it. So it's still something I think we kind of wrangle with about what effect that language has or what assumptions people have, even when it's not a centerpiece of their ideas.
I'm not going to quote anybody. You guys did that well. The Jews of Color Collective is an organization that attempts to lift up, center, and support Jews of color, which I highly recommend to you. I believe there's a local version of it getting started, but definitely be in touch with the national organization, Jews of Color Collective. There's a certain amount of creativity among us on the left out of mutual aid vibes. We're all of us who need something are getting together and offering it to everybody else who needs it, which I love. At a time of rising anti-Semitism, Jews need to talk about this among ourselves. We're scared. We never expect to have this conversation or live in this reality. Bonnie, I like what you said very much. The only thing I want to say about what you said is you said each of us individually has to come to terms. I want to say each of us individually can't do it. We have to come together as a group. We have to help each other do our individual work. The emphasis on individuality has us all out on our individual limb, trying to figure out our individual lives by our individual selves. And the human self was not built to carry its own weight. We need to be together against whatever this is, even if we don't quite agree on how to define what scares us. We need spaces in which we can come together and talk about it and support each other and be in a safe space where we know we will be heard for all the idiosyncrasy of our Jewishness.
I thank the speakers very much. Enjoyed all the presentations. One comment about Israel. When I talk to non-Jewish friends about Israel, they have no concept that the majority in Israel is people of color. They have absolutely no concept of that at all. Their picture of a Jew is a white person from Eastern Europe, which is not the majority in Israel. I think one of the problems that we're having is the emphasis of the talks today have been on we need dialogue, we need discussion, we need debate, and we need education. The two barriers to this are the barrier on the right, which is violence, which has been accepted, unfortunately, by the left. The barrier on the left to discussion has been cancel culture, which is a disaster for debate, discussion, and education. I'd like the panelists to comment on this.
You want to discuss? Comment on it? Get on the mic.
Yes, I just would like to know what your suggestions are if you're part of a congregation that refuses to talk about anti-Semitism. at least in terms of showing up for groups, or if you're in a group and let's say you say, have you ever had an anti-Semitic experience? And nobody has ever even thought that they've had anti-Semitic experience. I think some assimilation has erased a lot of what it means to be Jewish.
I'm going to give you just a quick response to that. Are you familiar with Leo Frank, who was lynched? There's a musical about it now. When many years later, Leo Frank's wife died, she was buried at night because the congregation was so frightened. I've also heard that congregation stopped doing anything identifiably Jewish outside their walls after that lynching. It's a thing.
Hi, I'm Joni. I'll identify who I am. Hi, I'm Joni. Identify who I am. I'm in the community. So I very much appreciate this dialogue and being able to have back and forth and a type of conversation. It's really, I think, very, very important. So I appreciate what that person said, that he thinks that we only get together maybe once a year. And I do, maybe, for at least for the last couple of years, I'm sure it's related to COVID, but during these last few years, I've looked for different things I personally, for myself, I know we need to be a group, but personally I've looked for things online, like what can I listen to educate myself while I'm sitting here sort of isolated, so to speak, to not be so isolated, even if I can't be next to somebody who might cough on me or whatever. So I saw, like, for instance, there's Jewish Federation of Portland that reached out and had like many different conversations, and they also made tapes of them so people could listen to them after if they weren't able to. Certain synagogues tried to have sometimes services or outreach or something, like either online or a little bit in person. So even if maybe it wasn't announced that we're going to have an anti-Semitic talk, perhaps if in those groups, I'm sure they got together to some degrees, and people, I would imagine, get together because we're Jews, we get together, and there were protests going on and things going on. So maybe it wasn't advertised, but I have a feeling it was here. I'm also thinking that wishing, very much, like, I agree that there'll be more like this, and I think we should invite people to, like, announcement. I don't know where we could put it necessarily. I'm not, but throw it out there to different organizations. And I appreciate that this gentleman on the far right goes out and speaks to different sort of organizations. I'm sorry, not recalling your name. I'm nervous here, but that he speaks to different type of groups. So I think that there are attempts that we are making some outreach. I definitely think more outreach could be done, and more of this dialogue would be helpful. And I think that's what they're suggesting to some degree, that we need more, that we need to do more. So I agree that there isn't maybe enough going on right now, but maybe this start a process that there can be more. And maybe Portland, maybe the metro area will do more. I hope there'll be more, and we can end anti-Semitism, or at least make it less, if not, and not end it in soon.
Thank you for having this. As someone who identifies as more left, being able to actually have a panel that is addressing anti-Semitism on the left as a topic, I think has been great. Rabbi Jacobs, I struggle a little bit with what you're saying in terms of being aware that if there is a boycott of Israel, that in and of itself is not anti-Semitic. And I want some help from you in breaking that down a little bit, because knowing I have a number of friends with kids in college or choosing colleges that are, some of whom are looking away from more liberal institutions because of cancel culture and being active and wanting to be able to be heard without being canceled. And so when you see something like what happened at UC Berkeley with the law school and preventing Zionist speakers from being able to speak there, and at the same time having the movement to BDS is very active on that campus and getting rid of all investments that are related to Israeli companies. That was happening there too. I personally look at it as it is not necessarily indicative that someone is anti-Semitic. However, it can be indicative. And I'm wondering if you think it's indicative or you're really encouraging us to break it down a different way.
Rabbi Jacobs, I think if you want to respond,
there's a few questions and comments, but I can jump into that. Yeah, I mean, it's very hard to untangle the pieces because everything is so contentious. So I'll say a few things. So one, I'm gonna say, of course, there's so many emotions in this, and it is very hard to separate out the idea of boycotting Israel or boycotting any country from the language that's sometimes used around it. So I'm gonna try. Like I said before, boycotts are a tactic. They're a tactic in movements. There's lots of tactics, right? Protest, advocacy, lobbying days, letters to the editor, 1,000 tactics that you can all name. Boycotts are one tactic. Probably many of us have engaged in a boycott at one point or another in our lives. I mean, some boycotts we're all participating in, like the boycott of Russia or North Korea. And we might have chosen to, I don't know, like my family currently is not buying Amy's, the frozen vegetarian things because the workers have been, have called for a boycott because of their horrific working conditions, right? So many of us participate in different kinds of boycotts. Countries, like I said, are countries. Israel is not equated with Jews, right? So boycotting Israel is very different from, let's say, a business saying, well, we won't serve Jews. That's straight up anti-Semitism. It's illegal. And of course, 20% of Israeli citizens are not Jewish, right? So it's not equated with Jews. That said, the reasons that people might choose to boycott Israel are a range, ranging from it's a call of Palestinian civil society to, it's very popular. When I was in college, Free Tibet was very popular. It's just things go through trends, and there is anti-Semitism there. We can't deny it. So it's kind of a complicated mix. And one other thing that I want to put into the mix is that sometimes when there's a BDS resolution on campus or just any situation of boycott, there are certain organizations, particularly in the Jewish community, on the right of the Jewish community, also in the Christian community, that sometimes get involved in ways that are not super productive. So the Berkeley situation, for example, it was not that University of Berkeley Law School banned Zionist speakers. It was a few organizations, right? We can go into the details of that, but something that happened was that it got reported on in certain right-wing Jewish press and blown up to a point that one couldn't even have a reasonable conversation about it. And so that is something that happens. And of course, every action creates a reaction. And so the discourse just becomes more and more heated to the point that you can't actually talk about the thing that is happening. I want to maybe just mention one example that happened, I guess, a year ago or so, that I think is just really instructive in a lot of ways. So Ben & Jerry's, I think a lot of people were following this situation. Ben & Jerry's decided that they were going to continue selling ice cream in Israel, but discontinue selling in the occupied Palestinian territories, which in my mind is like a very clear political stance. They were not boycotting Israel. They were making a statement that that their objection was to the ongoing occupation and they were not selling in settlements. And the reaction was pretty swift from both sides, but I would say more from the Israeli government and from more right-wing Jewish organizations saying that's anti-Semitism, you're boycotting Jews. They were never boycotting Jews. They were never even boycotting Israel. I'll tell you, I was in Israel a few months ago. You can buy Ben & Jerry's. It's like ridiculously expensive, and you would never buy it there for that reason, but it is there. It's available if you have, $7 or something for a pint. But like the response was to really, first of all, erase any distinction between Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories, and also to erase any distinction between Israel and Jews. Now, of course, people on the left were also on the farther left on the boycott movement were also not happy because Ben & Jerry's did not boycott Israel. And in fact, the founders, Ben & Jerry, came out with a op-ed in the New York Times saying really clearly that they care about the future of Israel and they were making a political decision. And so that was a situation where really nobody could have an honest conversation about what it means to make this, I think, a very principled decision to make a political stance and not actually boycott the country. So just want to say that like things get really heated on college campuses. I'm not on a college campus. Some folks here are. I very much trust the people who are on campus, the students, the staff, the chaplains, professors, et cetera, to understand their campus and to be able to deal with dynamics better than outside organizations. Often when outside organizations come in, things blow up in ways that are not super helpful. And so I just want to encourage us all when we're hearing these stories, particularly if they're kind of like on social media, traveling, to just kind of pause for a minute and maybe ask some more questions about what's happening on campus, but also just for ourselves. I know it's very emotional and it's very difficult. Try to separate between this is a political decision that's not anti-Semitism and, oh, now you're talking about, I don't know, the outsized power of the state of Israel, that's, of Zionism. Now you've crossed a line, and to be able to call that out again, as I said, because when we blur those lines, we make it harder to call out anti-Semitism when it's actually anti-Semitism, because when we call it out, then people sometimes on the left say, well, that's not anti-Semitism. I'm just criticizing Israel because you call everything, right? You're always crying wolf. You call everything anti-Semitism. So I also just want just to note a resource. This is, I don't know if you can see it on screen. This is a little booklet that Trua put out. It's called A Very Brief Guide to Anti-Semitism. If you go to our website, truah.org, you can find it. If you go truah.org/anti-Semitism, you'll find it immediately. And they're really like, you can see pocket size. You can download it also. It won't be as beautiful, but these pocket size booklets that we know that people have used like thousands of, it's been downloaded or purchased, I think more than 3,000 times. And we know that people are putting it out on at synagogues and at churches. Just last week, actually, a pastor friend of mine said, oh, I'm getting a packet of them and I'm just going to put it out on the table in our church. And we've heard that high school students and college students are just using them. So it's a really basic guide to what is anti-Semitism, like very, very basic history. And then also it does go into questions about, well, when is it criticism of Israel and when is it anti-Semitism? So I definitely would encourage you to take a look at that.
We've got about 100 of them here in the back, and I'll make sure everyone can grab one on their way out.
Any other questions, comments?
Can I just
Go ahead, Nate.
Sorry, I just wanted to say a couple things in relationship to what Rabbi Jacobs just said, and in answer to your question as well about boycott. I'm not going to contest the fact that Israel is a country like all others, and political stances that are taken vis-a-vis Israel, it is the same because it is a country, and yet it is the Jewish state. That is what Israel calls itself, and that's true even though 20% of its citizens are not Jewish. And we could have an other argument about the Jewish character of Israel, but that's how it characterizes itself, and that's how most people see it. And I just want to point out that there are, as a historian, I have to say that there are historical resonances for boycott in Jewish history that are very troubling, like the Nazi boycott of Jewish businesses. There were anti-Semitic boycotts of Jewish of Jews, just generally across the board, Jewish businesses in Poland in the 1920s and the 1930s. So that is there. I'm not saying that, therefore, boycott should not exist as a strategy. I'm just saying that there are those echoes within history that people, I think, need to be aware of and often aren't aware of. Ian, in response to your question about cancel culture, I wish I had more to say about it. I probably should as an academic at a university, but I will say that for those of you who are interested in knowing that our local urban university, PSU, which is what I know best, I think personally has done really well in that way. And I think there's a lot of universities, as Rabbi Jacobs suggested, that are handling it well and are making spaces for dialogue on campus. We usually hear about the ones that don't, where things get out of control, right? Because of those are the ones that are brought to our attention. Having said that, I'll say at the same time that I have a colleague on campus who is a right winger, and he has told me a few times in the past few years that he had hopes in the early years when he was a young academic that he'd be able to be part of the conversation, and he doesn't have that anymore. He doesn't feel like there's any space for him to really express his views on campus, which I think is a shame because, and I'm not saying that people would necessarily cancel him. It's just that he, as you know, in his own political stance, which he and I have plenty of arguments, but I want him to be able to have that space, and I think it's too bad that he doesn't. So I'm not sure how that fits into our larger discussion tonight, but perhaps someone will find it of relevance.
Let me jump into this a little bit. I think this actually gets to Spencer's point about why we have a conversation in this space and not just directed at the left. And I think it's because there's lack of consensus in these spaces. And there are political issues in here and approaches that I personally disagree with or have challenges with. And so I think it's useful to actually talk through these about what is it we're actually taking into the left spaces? What approaches are we taking in? You know, to speak honestly, I do not think the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement is anti-Semitic implicitly, nor is the serious criticism of Israel. We are talking about, you know, an incredibly right-wing government right now that's only getting more severe and really serious issues. These are going to be issues that are on our plate as having connections with that. And so I think we need to talk about serious ways about how to engage with that. I think, and there's also a difference, I think, between us having sort of a complicated relationship with Israel and our discomfort with it, and actually engaging with movements that are coming in that invisibilize Jews or engage in anti-Semitism. Those are kinds of being kind of complicated conversations that should not be reduced to one simple approach. And this often happens when flattening this discourse, particularly on college campuses. So for example, with the question about cancel culture, when I hear people complain about cancel culture, I think a lot of times what they're complaining about is a particular instance that they thought was unfair. But in other instances, it's not unfair. I have no bones about it. I want to cancel Marjorie Taylor Greene. I want to cancel a lot of people in power, meaning I want to take their power, I want to organize people and push them out and give power to other voices and things like that. And so I think what we're talking about is that we actually, well, at least what I'm talking about is I want to sort of empower people to have a different approach to this that honors people's actual marginalization, that confronts real issues in Israel, you know, kind of full bore. I think one of the differentiations that's really important is that whether or not the approach to Israel is based on facts and reason and connection with folks on the ground, or if it's based on kind of like misreadings of history or hyperbole or conspiracy theories, and that certainly plays itself out. As someone who has been very close to Palestinian solidarity organizers, there is movement on those sort of issues. And it happens by working directly with Jewish organizations and Jewish folks on a shared issue. That kind of bridge is happening more and more as we see the kind of shift Likud's making, or the kind of political shifts where I think there's a lot more alliances to be built. But I think it's really, really important to avoid, like I said in the beginning, hyperbole, painting with a broad brush, and assuming that all of these political actions are sort of reducible to that, even when they bring discomfort, I think.
Oh, hello. Oh, sorry. Oh, my bad. I didn't see you. Here I can. I had a quick comment and then a question. I just wanted to add, you know, I'm a proud Jewish supporter of BDS because that's what my Palestinian friends and my Palestinian comrades that I work with and that I know have asked me to, in the same way I boycott Energizer and Amy's. So, I think that's, yeah. But my question is kind of like, where is the Jewish left? It doesn't seem to exist much. When you listening to you all speak, it reminded me of the book Jews Without Money by Mike Gold, which was, we have this notion of Jews having this class character of this bourgeois class character, right? And Jews Without Money is saying, well, that's actually not true. There's all of these Jews that are in destitute poverty. And it seems to me that today, working class Jews are not organized, and they're not found in many Jewish spaces because, many synagogues, they have, for instance, membership fees or barriers to entry. And take the worker circle. It's no longer a socialist organization. It's a nonprofit. Jewish organization has been non-profitized. There is not a Jewish left. There's the Bund has a tiny thing in Melbourne, Australia, and they have a tiny little piece of the UK with a magazine because you have to, and 200 Twitter followers or something, and they technically exist. They may or may not have an address, right? There does not seem to be a Jewish left. There seems to be progressive Jews and leftist Jews, but if we are going to fight anti-Semitism on the left, there needs to be, it seems to me, and like we have said, a Jewish left. How do we get that? Where do we find that? Who do we look to? And how can we transcend the kind of non-profitization of what used to be a movement and something that was big? And I may add, was in many cases not Zionist. I mean, that is the political tradition of Jewish people for the vast majority of our history. Whether it, up to the destruction of the Bund, which exists a tiny bit, but that, that's also a newer thing. And I think many young people today, many young Jews today are just checked out of anything related to Israel. And it doesn't speak to them. And in my experience interacting with folks who do BDS work, and I work with Jewish Voice for Peace, so I also do BDS work and stuff like that. When there are not Jews in those spaces, anti-Semitism isn't challenged, but it's because of a lack of interest, because of a far-right apartheid regime. As my Jewish values, the way I was raised by my parents, don't allow me to identify with that. So if we're not there to have those conversations. This is totally a roundabout thing, but how do we build what we used to have?
I mean, I have big feelings on this. I think you're right. There's not a Jewish left in the way that the Bund was a Jewish left in the era of large socialist parties, but there is a decentralized, growing Jewish left. It's a lot more religious than it was 30 or 40 or 50 years ago. But for example, the Jewish left is blockading Cop City in Atlanta right now, and the Jewish left is organizing in Boston, actually with worker circles sometimes, but also an independent Minyan, Jewish anarchist groups. There is sort of a resurgence of that, and I think that gets to the Jewish specific space that we're talking about. But we can't expect it to look like the Bund. It's going to look like something different because the left in general looks different today. And the folks that are engaging in Jewish radicalism look differently. So they're not going to be just of these isolated Eastern European political traditions. They're going to bring all those traditions together. Yeah, I mean, you see this in Jewish anti-Zionist groups, like JVP is a good example of it has lots of different Jewish voices in it. So it ends up not being that kind of homogenous tradition. But this is something that people are intentionally trying to build now. But again, this has to do with the fragmentation of the left. And how do you build political organizations of people of like minds? That is tough. But I would say there are enough people, there are thousands and thousands of young Jews looking to build that right now. They have to find each other. And in a lot of ways, what they're finding is actually synagogue life as the pathway to get there. particularly in like post-denominational synagogue life. So whether or not that actually fits them, I think that's going to be debatable, but people are building an alternative, basically Jewish civic infrastructure. If the civic infrastructure doesn't represent them now, they're building it, which is a tough call because building infrastructure takes a generation and millions of dollars, and it's a real pain in the ass, but it is what people are sort of doing. So I'm sort of with you on that. I don't have an easy answer, but I think there's a lot of people committed to doing that work with you.
The thing that militates against Jewish organizing anywhere is, what's the reward for getting together with other Jews if you're going to be seen as not quite like the rest of us? There's absolutely no reason why a young adult Jew would want to be part of a Jewish-only group. First of all, who are you for saying it has to be Jewish only? That doesn't seem like leftist values that we would all agree with. And there's so few Jews here that probably most of the people that you march with are not Jewish. You can't defend yourself. You can't even figure yourself out when you're a very small minority, and the larger group welcomes you as part of that group as long as you're marching in step. What causes people to come together? Is it their awareness that individuals can't do it by themselves? That is a long road to learn.
Okay, on that note, we're going to wrap. We have one more? Okay.
Oh, no,
Rabbi
I just-
Jill has to go to bed, so make it brief.
I just wanted to say a quick word about the Jewish left from a historical perspective, of course, which is that the Bund was a really important part of Jewish leftist history, but so was socialist Zionism, really important part of it. And it's the fact that today the governing coalition in Israel is far right is a product of the history of the last few decades, but Israel was the establishment in Israel was strongly socialist, and of course we could have an argument about exactly how socialist it was and so on and so forth, but that was the founding ideology of Israel itself. So no, unfortunately the left has in the last decade and a half kind of dissolved in Israel, which is a tragedy in its own right, but that doesn't mitigate the fact that there is a long history there as well on the left connected to Zionism too. So that's just my 2 cents as a historian.
Okay. I want to thank all our panelists. Give a round of applause to Rabbi Jill Jacobs,
Rabbi Jill!
Rabbi Ariel Stone, Natan Meir, and Shane Burley. We'll be having, on a completely different subject, Death and Dying from a Jewish Perspective, May 11th here. It won't kill you to talk about death. So join us and join the EJC mailing list, and we'll send you a newsletter every Wednesday telling you what's up. Thanks for coming. Oh, and next on May 4th, Congregation Beth Israel will be having an Interrupting Antisemitism talk at 7 p.m. at the Dome at Congregation Beth Israel.